A Northern Alliance, 6 U.S. states primed to align with Canada. Some U.S. states are so closely tied to Canada that they could shift north without a war or dramatic upheaval. It's not a whim or a fancy, it's for very real reasons. These states are driven by economies and trade dependent on Canada, social benefits they feel aren't protected in the U.S., and instability in key industries. Canada has quietly become a land of opportunity for states feeling left behind. In this article, we'll explore 6 states that could technically belong to Canada overnight. Some of the names might surprise you, while others. 1. Oregon. At first glance, Oregon feels quintessentially American, with pure West Coast vibes. But look a little closer and you'll see it's been tightly linked with Canada for a long time. It's not just geography, Oregon and Canada share a lot when it comes to politics and culture. Progressive politics, strict environmental policies, and a social vision sometimes make Oregon feel more like Vancouver than its southern neighbors like California or Nevada. Economically, over $4 billion in trade flows between Oregon and Canada every year, from agriculture, timber, and energy to tech. This makes the relationship more than a friendly partnership, it's a crucial economic lifeline for the state. Oregon businesses rely heavily on the Canadian market, and many Canadian companies see Oregon as a key gateway into the U.S. Culturally, Oregon mirrors Canada in its approach to healthcare, climate change initiatives, and labor rights. With strict environmental protections, incentives for clean energy, and progressive labor laws, many Oregonians feel their state is ahead of the rest of the country. There have even been discussions about leaving the U.S., not to join Idaho like the Greater Idaho movement, but to become part of Canada. If the federal government keeps pushing policies that clash with Oregon's values, especially on environment. 2. Alaska. Imagine living in Alaska, the ultimate frontier, remote and isolated from the rest of the U.S., and realizing you're actually closer to Canada than most of America. Geographically, Alaska is completely separated from the continental U.S., and its ties to Canada go far beyond just sharing a border. In many cases, supply lines and freight routes from Alaska have to pass through Canada to connect with the rest of the country. Alaska's economy is tied to Canada more than you might think. Oil, seafood, timber, and other natural resources, the state's main industries, all involve significant participation from Canadian companies. Some of the largest fishing operations in Alaska rely entirely on Canadian waters, while Canadian businesses invest heavily in energy and resource extraction. If these connections were disrupted, Alaska's economy would face serious risks, from lost revenue to direct impacts on jobs and local livelihoods. This relationship isn't just economic. Military and defense ties between Alaska and Canada are extremely close. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, integrates U.S. and Canadian forces, meaning that in an emergency, Alaska can coordinate with Canada almost instantly, sometimes even before Washington can step in. This creates a natural alliance that few other U.S. states can claim. Alaska has always technically been American, but its geographic isolation combined with deep economic and cultural ties to Canada sometimes makes the state feel closer to its northern neighbor. A big enough political or economic shock, like a federal policy shift or resource instability, could make Alaska seriously consider looking north instead of always. 3. Vermont. Vermont has a colorful history of independence. Before joining the U.S. in 1791, it was its own republic with a strong sense of self-rule that still lingers in the mindset of its residents today. Progressive policies, an open-minded culture, and a lifestyle closely connected to nature make Vermont feel closer to Canada than many other U.S. states. In fact, there are even secessionist movements within the state, most notably the Second Vermont Republic, which envisions not just becoming an independent nation but possibly joining Canada. What drives Vermont in this direction? First and foremost, the economy. Vermont maintains strong trade ties with Canada, especially with neighboring Quebec. Agriculture, organic food, dairy production, clean energy, and social programs all align closely with Canada's development model. Many Vermont businesses even rely on the Canadian market to keep operations stable. It's not just economics, culture and nature also play a big role. Quaint small towns, lush forests, mountain lakes, and a shared love for the maple tree, the national symbol of Canada, create a cultural connection that feels very real. Vermont's progressive politics also align with Canadian social, healthcare, and environmental policies, painting a picture of a northern Vermont that's both appealing and familiar. If U.S. politics were to grow tense with federal decisions running counter to the state's values, Vermont would have every reason to look north. 4. Michigan. The relationship between Michigan and Canada isn't just about geography, it's an economic bond so tight that a disruption could throw the entire state economy into a crisis. We're talking about $80 billion in annual trade crossing the border, making Michigan the U.S. state most deeply tied to Canada economically. The Detroit-Windsor corridor is one of North America's busiest trade routes, with thousands of trucks moving goods every day, from auto parts and industrial machinery to food and consumer products. Michigan's auto industry, the backbone of the state, relies heavily on Canada. Some vehicle models are assembled from parts imported from both countries, and production can only run smoothly when cross-border supply chains are uninterrupted. This connection extends into infrastructure, bridges, tunnels, and even the power grid. Michigan also depends on electricity from Canada to keep its factories and cities running. Historically, Michigan even considered joining Canada after the Toledo War in the 19th century. While it never happened, the sense of being closer to Canada than the U.S. has never fully faded from the state's consciousness. Border cities, business communities, and residents continue to maintain cultural, economic, and social ties with Canada, making the country not just a partner but sometimes a neighbor closer than Washington. 5. Minnesota. At first glance, Canada may not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Minnesota, but the connection is undeniable. Geographically, Minnesota shares nearly 1,550 miles of border with Canada, stretching from vast lakes to endless forests. In 2023, the state exported over $7 billion in goods to Canada, making it one of Minnesota's most important economic partners. From agriculture, dairy, and livestock to energy and technology, this trade flow is a lifeline for many industries. Minnesota's ties to Canada aren't just economic. Culture and people create a unique sense of closeness. Minnesotans are friendly, nature-loving, and endure harsh winters, much like their Canadian neighbors. Many have even been mistaken for Canadians simply because of their accent or lifestyle. Festivals, food, and traditions in some border areas echo Quebec and other nearby Canadian provinces, making Minnesota and Canada feel at times like a continuous cultural region rather than two separate countries. Politics is another major factor. Minnesota's progressive policies on healthcare, the environment, and social services align much more closely with Canada than most other U.S. states. This makes the state feel connected to the values Canada pursues, from public health and environmental protection to labor rights. With all these economic, cultural, historical, and political connections, the idea of Minnesota leaning toward Canada isn't far-fetched. Should the U.S. face a major political or economic crisis, it's easy to imagine Minnesota considering a northern path as a viable option. 6. Washington. If you think of Washington as just the home of tech giants and coffee culture, you might be in for a surprise. Its connection to Canada runs far deeper than most realize. The idea of leaning north isn't far-fetched. Washington isn't just a geographic neighbor, its relationship with Canada spans every dimension: economics, politics, culture, and even infrastructure and energy. In 2023, Washington traded over $20 billion in goods with Canada, making it one of the U.S. states most economically dependent on its northern neighbor. The state also relies on Canada for energy, particularly hydroelectric power flowing down from British Columbia, which helps stabilize the electricity supply for major cities like Seattle and Tacoma. Washington's policies and politics are also much closer to Canada than most of the U.S. When it comes to healthcare, environmental protection, and social services, the state embodies a progressive spirit that mirrors many Canadian policies. Washington has even pushed for closer connections with British Columbia, including proposals for a high-speed rail line linking Seattle to Vancouver in under 2 hours. Culturally, the similarities between the two regions are undeniable. From Vancouver to Seattle, people share lifestyles, a love of the outdoors, a tech-driven economy, and, of course, a deep passion for coffee. Many British Columbians work in Washington but still consider Canada home. This crossover makes Washington almost function like a Canadian province in many ways, from daily life and social habits to business relationships. With all these connections, Washington emerges as a prime example of the trend of certain U.S. states growing closer to Canada, a model showing that national borders don't always determine a region's direction.